Hello and welcome to this webinar provided by TeamTelligent. This is the second in a series of 3 webinars. This webinar, Why Do M&A Attempts Fail?, is going to be presented by myself, Roger, and Bob Eichinger with TeamTelligent, the founders and thought leaders for the organization. And what we would say to you in this series is that it's really important to understand the nature of M&A, and then of course the evidence around M&As and their failures, and then of course in our third webinar what we plan to do about it. This particular quote, which comes out of Business Week, reminds us that as folks study M&As, virtually every serious study shows that it is difficult to bring off a successful merger. And of course, we think we know the reasons for that. As one writer noted, the deal is won or lost after it's done. They fail to integrate the 2 companies after the toasts have been exchanged. And of course, that's an indication of one of the first areas of problem that we know exists in promoting the failure of mergers and acquisitions and alliances. Some attorneys who've been at the heart of lots of M&A activity made the observation that in 30 years, as the heads of a merger and acquisition practice, they found that the subtle factors, what's referred to as the soft factors, the people, the ways in which the culture is fostered, the kinds of communication and the nature of the leadership that's provided, in fact, are the kinds of factors that become more significant in the ability of the merger and acquisition activity to be successful. As noted here, a disproportionate amount of time is spent on the financials, as those are seen as the hard numbers related to making the M&A, the rationale for the M&A in the first place. If we look at the history of mergers and acquisitions, such as those you see listed here, we know that each and every one of these, when studied and analyzed and reported on, the writers and analysts will say, well, this didn't work because of failed corporate cultures. This is the problem that occurs when corporate leaders, in fact, ignore the critical nature of culture in the ultimate success of the M&A initiative. Now, one of the things that's important to be mindful of is that when we say not successful, we really mean that the activity did not produce the sort of financial outcomes and business benefits that were anticipated for the whole reasons for the merger and acquisition activity to start with. And as you see in this particular quote, most experts will report that it's the really bad merger planning and the poor integration that tends to create the problems in mergers and acquisition and alliance activities. Though everybody wants to be successful and they see the rationale and the reasons for the initiative and why they find that they have to make a variety of cuts and a variety of activities to reassure customers and deal with cultural conflicts, all of which require a great deal of energy and a particular kind of managerial and leadership attention. Often when people do the postmortem on mergers and acquisitions, they will identify the fact that the acquiring company overpaid for the operation, whether it was IP they were buying or a company for extending their market reach or creating alliances for parallel industries. Often they have overestimated the cost savings and the potential financial synergies that would lead to the kind of performance that were expected. And of course, this overestimation leads to underperformance in projects and shareholder expectations. There's often a dithering or perseveration over uh, integration operations and details, and those particular activities create frustration for employees and customers and often delay results. We know that the obsession around cost cutting to try to save the deal damages the business and affects employees and customers in ways that make the M&A activity less successful. Those are the kinds of findings you'll see in business magazines such as Business Week, which provided this particular summary. In the Academy of Management study by Marks and Mervis, identified that fewer than a quarter of M&As achieve their financial objectives. Is it the buying of the wrong company, paying too much, wrong time, or in the process of conceiving and executing the deal, were those processes ultimately flawed? The Academy report continues to say that more than 3/4 of mergers and acquisitions fail to retain projected results and produce the higher than because of the higher than expected costs and lower than projected returns, for all the reasons that we've been talking about and we'll explore in more detail in our webinar. We know that the time and energy spent to promote the morale and productivity in the organization plummets, as well as quality. Customers go elsewhere, and often the talent begins to go elsewhere as well, leaving the acquiring company and the acquired weaker as a result of the M&A activities. Well, we know in a summary that M&A attempts do not work. There is inadequate due diligence. There's a lack of a compelling strategic rationale. There's unrealistic estimated synergies and conflicting cultures, and the failure to meld or integrate are all of the factors that have been studied by really over a number of decades by different researchers and different analysts, and they keep coming back with the same indications and the same results. So the natural question that Bob's going to have us explore is, what should you do?
Thank you, Roger. All of the researchers always end their book or their articles in the Harvard Business Review with a to-do list. This is an example of that list. Thorough due diligence. Now, there's two kinds of due diligence. There's hard due diligence. That's the economics and cash on hand and cash in the bank and logistics and worth of the assets. I think we probably do a pretty good job at that. There are some events in history of M&A where due diligence missed something significant. But what the key issue is soft due diligence. That is, what are their culture like? What do their 25 leaders look like? What do the heads of the key functions look like? Do they have any history in M&A? How have they responded to M&A attempts before? A very interesting one, and we'll spend a little time on this, is settle leadership issues first. Almost all M&As I've been involved in, the controlling CEO always wants to put together integration task forces. So he'll put together a task force for the sales group, for the marketing group, for the manufacturing group, for the logistics group, and their task is to work on synergy and integration. Now, when people do that, you have winners and losers on those task forces. You have people who are not going to survive, because if synergy and integration are expected, layoffs are going to be part of it. So we'll talk a little bit about settle leadership issues first. I was on the golf course with two CEOs who were in the middle of this effort, and I think at the 6th hole, the dominating CEO, the one that is going to be CEO afterwards, say, I tell you what, I'll take 4 senior positions and you take 4 senior positions. So that's not a very good way to staff. So growth is better than synergy and integration. In almost every failed M&A, there is an inability to reach synergy and integration goals. So putting together and integrating 2 truck fleets is not as easy as it sounds, and the cost savings are not as much, and it takes longer than anticipated. Get early wins is an important one because in the sense of creating a new culture, you want the new organization, whatever it was designed to accomplish, get some early wins. And then we've seen this in change management. We've seen it in M&A, communicate, over-communicate. Prioritize, because there's always more to do in these situations than you could possibly achieve. So this is similar to everybody's research list. So vision and business proposition first. That is, why are we putting these 2 organizations together, either in an acquisition or a merger? Why is that an advantage to the shareholders and stakeholders and customers? Once you have that, you create a success profile of what that looks like in terms of a skill set in each of the key positions in the melded organization, and then have a dance card of how we're going to accomplish this. How are we going to lay off half of the executives and half of the senior vice presidents who will not be needed in the new organization? How's all that going to go? Select the top leaders first, and then form integration task forces of people who are actually going to be left when the organization combines. Here's a graphic version of that thing. So it starts with a best bet business proposition that leads to organizational capabilities in order to achieve the projections and estimates of this combined organization. What are the cultural attributes that would work best, and what are the people attributes? What's the success profile of that? The next chart shows how the people proposition should be done, and it is almost never done this way. So you start with the vision of the organization. Why, in one I worked on, why are we putting Honeywell and Allied Signal together? And if we did put them together, what additional products and services, why would that be attractive to a customer base? If we are now going to be in all of the businesses Honeywell brought with it and all of the businesses Allied brought with it, what kind of a culture would that require? If any of you know those 2 organizations, Honeywell is called Minnesota Nice, and Allied was called Eastern Ice. So they had diametrically opposed cultures when they put this organization together. The way this is supposed to work is you take the people pool from organization A, and you take the, not so much the people pool, but the leader pool from organization B. You take a look at the success profile that was derived from the new combined organization and the dance card on how integration and synergy is going to be carried out. And then you create a new leadership team with no considerations as to source, including the possibility that neither CFO from Honeywell or Allied fits the success profile of this new organization. Now, this is the best way to do it. It's almost never done this way. Usually there's a dominating organization in a merger and acquisition, and the dominating organization gets the top jobs. So it's just a political ego hubris play. But this is the way it's done. The other piece of advice we get from the researchers is get the bad stuff done as fast as possible. The worst sequence, and I've seen this in every M&A I've worked with, the dominating CEO comes and gives a presentation in an all-hands meeting to the subordinate organization. And they get everybody going with a goosebump speech about how great this organization is. We wouldn't have merged or bought this organization if it wasn't the best. All of you are the best. This is really going to be great. You're all fantastic. Not to worry. 3 weeks later, there's an 854-person layoff. So in every one of these I've watched, the incoming CEO who's going to survive the merger or acquisition lies. Just lies to the subordinate organization. And you can imagine the engagement scores going down and the motivation scores going down and the enthusiasm for the combined organization. So it's best to get this out of the way. Culture, as we said, should be in the service of the business proposition. It should not be just a remaining organization based on what the CEO wants. So this is what usually happens. You've got a dominant organization in the light blue. You've got a subordinate organization in the gray. The CEO of the dominant organization is the surviving CEO. And he or she basically decides. He may give a speech that's different than that, but basically decides, I like the way we do things, so it's going to be our way. I had a personal experience with this because I sold my company 10 years ago. I got the goosebump speech from the CEO. I think we signed the deal on Friday. Everybody was excited. On Monday, the CFO and the chief HR officer and the head of logistics showed up in my office Monday morning. And I greeted them and said, I'm excited to have you here. What can I do for you? And all three of them said in unison, we're here to change basically everything you do. We're going to throw out your accounting system. We're going to throw out your benefits. We're going to take different holidays. We're going to change the pay system. We're going to change the bonus system. So the first day after the deal was signed, they basically said, we're going to do our culture. This is a story I've heard a lot. In the Allied Signal Honeywell case, that was Larry Bossidy and Bonsignori. And they said, we're going to put the two pieces of the culture together that are the best. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a study of the best of the blue culture and the best of the gray culture. And we're going to put those two together. And that's going to be the resulting culture. About $2.3 billion later of market cap, they decided this wasn't working. It was almost impossible to put Minnesota Nice together with Northeast Ice. The way this is supposed to work, if you really did it right, is you would create a culture with cultural attributes and competencies that the new combined organization would need to win in the marketplace. You would announce to a super all-hands meeting that we are abandoning both of our originating cultures. And instead, we're going to create a new culture from scratch. Really not, there's going to be overlap, but we're going to create a new culture. We're going to have new rituals, customs, ceremonies. We're going to have new awards. We're going to do things differently in line with the combined business proposition.
And as you've heard, our experience has been that we can see the problems coming. We know what the advice is for how to deal with those problems and the way those problems need to be addressed for successful M&A activities. And yet we have a consistent evidence that culture management is, while that's the key skill set, is often not applied in the processes, and as a result produces the sorts of failures of mergers and acquisitions that we've shared with you and that we have explored. Now, as we have thought about the ways in which these issues have evolved and the kinds of issues that researchers have pointed to, we know, for example, that the typical potential showstoppers are very quickly the emerging distrust that evolves with the two different management groups, the whole question of how to deal with governance in this new initiative and effort, the persistence of unrealistic synergies. People keep trying to find that synergy, which may never really have been there. The threats to the customer relationships begin to be quite significant in both of the entities that are beginning to have customer challenges. The risk of the talent drain, it really translates very quickly in the loss of people who are particularly high potentials, who like to make things happen and who want to be a part of solving complex problems. The debt burden can often be a significant challenge as the merged organization or acquired organization that seeks to move forward. The operational issues often can be far more significant than anticipated, and often, at least in my experience in working with different M&A activities, the area that gets to be most problematic is how to merge the IT systems. Very often the legacy systems in the acquiring company are quite different than those in the acquired entity, and it is a huge challenge to get the files to talk to each other in a productive, synergistic way that gains the synergies that were expected. The disruptions that begin to occur in a variety of places in the entity get to be very expensive, and managing those and covering the costs with those becomes pretty formidable. We see very often that all of the benefits for employees begin to be modified and adjusted because the cost equations have to be changed, and that in fact competitors can quickly begin to match often the salaries and benefits of the talent, and you invite the talent just to come on by. And we know these showstoppers are pretty present throughout all of the M&A studies and M&A analyses that we've been able to do.
If you back up, Roger, let me add to the threats to customer relations. Allied had an aerospace business and Honeywell had an aerospace business. Honeywell did electronics and Allied did brakes and hydraulics and mechanical systems. So both CEOs said, this is unbelievably, we compete against each other in the marketplace. Now we can go to the aircraft manufacturers and say, and the program was called Tip to Tail. So the head of marketing and sales made a special trip to their largest customer and said, we are extremely excited to let you know that we now have a tip-to-tail service that we can give you because of this merger, in that it's a one bid process. We cover everything in the plane. all the electronics, all the hydraulics, all of the brakes, all the mechanical systems. The aircraft person said, we would never do that. We would never rely on a single vendor for the entire airplane. It's too big of a risk for us. So you're going to have to select, if you want to do the electronics, we'll take a bid on that. Or if you want to do the brakes and mechanicals, we'll take on that. And the whole dream the two CEOs had on the golf course crashed. But that's an example of an assumed customer benefit that turns out not to be correct.
Oops.
So if you look at a pre-combination checklist, the critical success factors and operating principles for the combined organization and the culture, as we have said ad nauseum, the problem is with missed integration and synergy. They overestimate how much money they're going to save and underestimate the time it's going to take. Communication, most of those early meetings are lies, which lead to the chart that Roger showed you with distrust between the two management staffs. Do the top leaders first. Particularly number 5, look at barriers to synergy and integration. Do a cross-company cultural audit to see how big the mountain is that we have to climb. Before you decide for a customer that you're going to offer products and services that are different in the past, you better do some focus groups with key customers. I've seen that many times before. And then you end up with a critical issues identification for the person who's going to do the merger. Roger's going to take us through the culture clash signs.
Why don't you first give us these merger syndromes, and I'll get into culture class stages.
Okay. We get a preoccupation with the cultural issues because over on the right-hand side, the clash of cultures is very frequent. In my background, I was an employee at Pillsbury, and I went to my first meeting, and I noticed that there was a group of people sitting on one side of the table and a group of people on the other that had quite different viewpoints of the issues we were discussing. So after the meeting, walking back to our office, I asked my boss, what was that? And she said, well, the people on the right-hand side of the table were from Green Giant, and the people on the left-hand side of the people were from Pillsbury, and we bought Green Giant. Oh, okay. And I said, how long ago? 8 years. So 8 years after putting together the organization, there were still cultural identities to being a Green Giant person or a Pillsbury surfer. We also find people doing worst case scenario stories and narratives by the water cooler. You get constricted communication. You begin to get into crisis management. Top management has the illusion of control where the people down in the bottom of the organization know that that's not true. You get a lot of we versus they terminology. That's what happened in the Pillsbury Green Giant. There is inevitably a dominant organization being superior to the people left behind from the inferior organization. Years later, I was an employee of General Mills, and General Mills bought Pillsbury. And the same thing happened. So the General Mills people were all superior to the Pillsbury people. And prior to that, the Pillsbury people were superior to the Green Giant people. You get win-lose conflicts, you get open conflict, you get decisions by coercion or horse trading or default. It doesn't take much to see that the merger of blending two cultures together into one better culture generally doesn't work, and you're going to pick up the signs pretty quickly.
In fact, we know there's some definitive stages of culture clash, and like Bob, as he shares with some of his experiences, I'm reflecting on a merger situation, acquisition situation a couple years ago with some banks in Pennsylvania. And just as you see on these culture clash stages, it is exactly what began to transpire, where as certain meetings were held with different management groups, they were in their own little cliques, and there was no effort to try to get them to engage. And then it breaks. There were comments made, about, well, we're such a different culture. Our way of doing business is so different than their way of doing business. We're customer centric, and they're not as customer centric as we are. And so there was this undertow of pointing out to how superiors one set of banking products were over the other. And of course, that conversation, that narrative leads very naturally into, well, we are better than they are, and we are doing things that make business make sense better than they do. And once we get into that kind of we and they magnification of differences, stereotyping is very natural to follow, where now anybody who calls from the acquiring company into the acquired company or operation, they will say, well, they have called again, and they are imposing on us some of their idiocy that's getting in the way of us being able to do business. And it becomes very much a we versus them, and very much a denigration of cultures. And those issues can eat away at people's morale, their engagement. We all know that when you look at engagement surveys and you see the degree to which people are engaged and offer discretionary time and effort, that makes a huge difference. But that kind of effort drops precipitously when people feel they're in the middle of this kind of clash. And of course, as we know, there are particular kinds of things that could be done to deal with the ease of clash. You'll notice the word respect, that's spelled out by the acronym off onto the side. And it has to do with, as you see, the first important thing to do is recognize there are different cultures, and just put that on the table and do the best to identify what the virtues, the similarities, the differences are of the different cultures, to be conscious about an expected clash, and to sensitize folks to the different dynamics. And that takes lots of time and energy. It takes lots of communication. It takes fostering relationships to build as many bridges as possible, and to be very purposeful in creating mechanisms for learning about the different cultures and the different ways of doing business. This translates into things like having people talk about their client experiences, having them talk about their products and understand how they typically approach the delivery of a certain product or service to their customer. And so it gives a chance for everyone to understand how they're similar and how they're different. The emphasis on building a new organization in a common culture just takes a lot of time and intentionality. You have to do things where people begin to see, as Bob mentioned earlier, that there are new routines, new rituals, new ways in which people are going to be acknowledged and recognized, and a new way of behaving in the new entity that is the byproduct of the merger or the acquisition. And it becomes incredibly important to identify those leverage points in the organization and the people who are facilitating, and to make sure that you take those who are the big opinion leaders in the organization and get them on the right side of this conversation about how the new entity needs to operate and the kind of relationships that are expected to take hold throughout the entity. And to be cognizant that these transitions really take time, and that requires folks to understand they're in an emotional transition as well as in a procedural transition. And sometimes those emotional transitions just simply require recognition and being listened to, people being listened to about what they're letting go of and what they are being asked to take hold of. So as we know these things, we also happen to know, as we'll explore, that there are particular roles that must be fulfilled for M&As to be successful.
So we looked at all of the research and all of the experiences Roger and I have over the last 50 years of working in M&A, and we tried to outline the roles that are necessary to increase the chances that M&A works. What we have learned is that it is still tough, although it depends upon what kind. There are 5 different kinds of M&A. Some are harder to carry off than others. And we know that integration and synergy management and cultural management are the toughest parts, which are in the red. So create and present opportunity reports, which have to do with estimating what the difficulty is going to be with synergy integration and cultural integration. And then set and execute an integration framework, which is the soft part. So to introduce the next webinar, Roger and I took these 10 roles and we coded them back to our leadership and management profiles to see what the key characteristics are of someone who does this well. And we, of course, found that the same person probably is not good at both the white and the red. So it is very uncommon to have those characteristics together. So one thing we'll talk to you in the next webinar is it really takes 2 people to carry off good M&A. So the thought that there's going to be an M&A person in charge, an executive, and they're going to take you through all 10 of these steps is an unlikely plan that probably won't lead to success. So you need a executive that can do the hard stuff, the negotiating, the deal making, the finance. And then you need an executive that's good at change management and the soft stuff. And for the most part, it's not the same person. So those of you who are interested in that, our 3rd webinar will cover all of that in detail.
So as Bob noted, our 3rd webinar will have us take a deep dive into the kinds of very pragmatic things you can do from a leadership level to management level to make M&A go well. And we invite you to listen to all 3 of the webinars that are on our website, www.teamtelligent.com. And remember, we gave you the territory of M&A. We've talked about in this webinar the various challenges and issues and the very predictable problems with mergers and acquisitions. And in our 3rd, we'll give you some solutions. This has been a webinar by TeamTelligent. Thank you.